Terrence McNally, and welcome to another newly recorded episode of Free Forum, a world that just might work. And I'm going to be speaking today with CORY DOCTOROW. He's a science fiction author, activist, and journalist, author most recently of the novel Walkaways, the graphic novel In Real Life, and the nonfiction book Information Doesn't Want to Be Free, about earning a living in the internet age. And you can learn more about all of this, and it's a deep and robust website with access to lots of things at craphound.com. That's CRAPHOUND, craphound.com. After a 3-year hiatus, I've been doing a new interview every other week since Trump's Electoral College victory. Paul Hawken on climate change, Naomi Klein on the book No Is Not Enough, Arlie Hochschild on her book Strangers in Their Own Land and the Stories That Divide Us, Robert Wright on why he's a Buddhist. So it's kind of what's going on, how to respond to it, and how to stay sane while you're doing that. The show airs as specials on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA, streams weekly on the Progressive Voices Network on TuneIn. Podcasts are available anytime, anywhere on Apple Podcasts, Podomatic.com, and at my site, terrencemcnally.net. I always like to plug participation for websites and organizations that good to be involved with in these days is indivisibleguide.com. Very up-to-the-minute sort of ways to deal with what's going on in Washington. Indivisibleguide.com. There's now about 5,000 local sort of chapters of that. OurRevolution.com is a similar organization, grew out of the Bernie Sanders campaign. MoveOn.org and CourageCampaign.org, a couple of organizations, Move On nationally, Courage Campaign in the state of California, that were for a long time primarily digital, but have over the last few years coordinated their work more closely with on-the-ground grassroots work. So, it's not just during elections that we have to be involved. Things are happening every day behind the tweets and behind the news, and these are ways for you to get involved. Indivisibleguide.com, OurRevolution.com, MoveOn.org, and CourageCampaign.org. Now, I've heard of today's guest, CORY DOCTOROW, many times over the years, primarily as a provocative voice of sanity in questions of technology and society. But I'd never read any of his fiction. And in the fall of 2017, I saw him speak at the annual Bioneers Conference up in the Bay Area. And he's just, by the way, the latest of several guests that I have discovered at Bioneers over the years. And I've been pursuing him as a guest ever since, and finally we were able to sync our schedules. As I said, CORY DOCTOROW is a science fiction author, activist, journalist, and blogger. He's co-editor of BoingBoing.net. He's a special consultant to the Electronic Frontier Foundation, an MIT Media Lab research affiliate, and a visiting professor of computer science at Open University in the UK. His recent books include Walkaways, that's a novel for adults, a YA graphic novel called In Real Time, the nonfiction business book, Information Doesn't Want to Be Free, and the young adult novel, Homeland. Now, in preparing for this conversation, I read articles, blog posts, some of his fiction, and though DOCTOROW's primary expertise might seem to be on the relationship of society and technology, it occurred to me that when he sets out to write fiction about the future, he can't focus on just one aspect of society, technology, or the internet. He's got to imagine and express the whole world his characters inhabit in their daily lives, as well as how they think and feel about it. So that means that he, in what I've read and when I've listened to talks of his and interviews with him, he has a lot of knowledge and a lot of insight around an awful lot of things. So when I took a break from preparation for this interview and I checked out a number of articles, these just happened to be opened on my browser that I'd opened yesterday but hadn't yet had a chance to read, I noticed that one after another seemed right up his alley. And these are 5, are all from the UK Guardian of Monday, January 21st. These are the headlines. Dutch surgeon wins landmark right to be forgotten case. This is a surgeon who had been formally disciplined for her medical negligence. She won a legal action to remove Google search results about her case. And according to her lawyer, the ruling will ensure doctors need no longer be judged by Google on fitness to practice. Another headline, Google fined record $57 million. 50 million euros, by French data protection watchdog. The French data protection watchdog CNL has fined Google a record 50 million EU for failing to provide users with transparent and understandable information on its data use policies. Basically, they said that its data use policies were sprinkled through a bunch of different files, a bunch of different documents, and said that it did not make it easy for someone to actually know what they needed to know to use the service. Third headline, new video sheds more light on students' confrontation with Native American. This was the confrontation that happened over the weekend on the mall in Washington. And initial footage appeared to show students, some wearing pro-Trump MAGA hats, from a Kentucky high school taunting an Omaha tribe elder and Vietnam vet. And it turns out that when there was context added to this, when people saw the fuller video, it changed what had happened and changed people's responses. But that didn't stop an awful lot of people from reacting to the initial clip with all sorts of opinion and vituperation and condemnation, etc. Another one, second woman carrying gene-edited baby, Chinese authorities confirm. And this one is that last year it was revealed that the first, as far as we know, gene-edited baby had been conceived. Well, it turns out that another woman in that experiment has conceived. And the provincial government investigation found that the scientist had forged ethical review papers and deliberately evaded supervision in carrying this out. And finally, one that is a headline we see all too often, Greenland's ice melting faster than scientists previously thought. And it's increased, the pace of ice loss has increased fourfold since 2003, as the enormous glaciers are depositing ever larger chunks of ice into the Atlantic Ocean, where it melts, causing sea levels to rise. Every one of these headlines seems relevant to this conversation. I mean, what in the world is this world? Where are we headed? And what can we do? Welcome, CORY DOCTOROW, to Freeform, a world that just might work. And let me tell listeners, we're recording this conversation Tuesday, January 22nd, 2019.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's a real pleasure.
Okay. I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the ideas and the work that we talk about. And I cited a few of your, posts and so on. But can you tell us in your own words, and I'm okay if you take a little while with this because it often makes all the difference, a bit about your path to the work that you find yourself doing today, and feel free to mention mentors, turning points, moments of decision, that sort of thing.
Sure. Well, I was born and raised in Canada. My father was an asylum seeker. He was a displaced person who was born while his parents were living in a camp in Azerbaijan. They were Red Army deserters who had been both inducted into the Red Army during World War II. My grandfather was a Pole, and my grandmother was a Russian who had been a child soldier during the siege of Leningrad. And so I was raised in Canada, and my father became a computer scientist, so we had computers around the house from very early on. In the mid-'70s, we had terminals connected to the university mainframes at the University of Toronto. And so I got involved with both software development and radical politics as a kid. My parents were also both political radicals. My father is a Trotskyist, as is my mother. My mother's a feminist organizer as well. And was a leader in the Canadian pro-choice movement when I was a child. And so I grew up in those circles, went to groovy alternative schools where things were very unstructured and kids were really expected to find their own way, and that was really good for me. It worked so well for me that I spent 7 years in my 4-year high school. And then discovered that going to a high school where you design your own curriculum and are expected to find your own mentors to teach it is a lot like being in grad school. And so undergrad education was very stultifying. I dropped out of 4 undergrad programs in the next 2 years and then quit finally to work in the software industry. I started a software company during the .com bubble. It was an open source peer-to-peer file-sharing company called OpenCola. And when our investors started to freak out because of the Napster lawsuits, I got involved with the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which was an organization at the time that was very much involved in these early liability issues about whether or not technologists would be barred from making tools on the grounds that someone might misuse them, or whether we would allow these general-purpose tools to flourish. And as a company that I'd helped founded was in the midst of an acquisition offer, and as our venture capitalists were getting more aggressive about squeezing out the founders so that they could get a bigger share from that acquisition, I just quit and went to work for Electronic Frontier Foundation and was their European director for 3 years. I moved to London. And then at the same time, I had been writing and selling a lot of fiction. And at a certain point, my fiction career was going well enough that I really wanted to write full-time. And so I put in my notice, remained very friendly and affiliated with the FF, but spent the next 10 years starting a family in London and writing science fiction novels and selling them and touring them and having them translated into lots of languages and going to places all over the world. Probably best known for a novel called Little Brother. It's a young adult novel about kids in San Francisco who, after a terrorist attack, find that the city that they love has been turned into a kind of police state, and realize that a terrorist attack is a fleeting thing, but the authoritarianism that follows from it is forever. And they declare war on the Department of Homeland Security as a kind of occupying army and use high-tech guerrilla warfare techniques, including a network of hacked cryptographically secured wireless Xboxes, to plan and run a guerrilla insurrection that results in the DHS being kicked out, the California Highway Patrol intervening to shut down the DHS's torture chambers, and the rule of law and the Constitution being restored to San Francisco. And that novel has taken me lots of places. It was translated into Persian during the Iranian uprising that led to the last but one election, and also into Burmese during the Myanmar uprising. It's taught in the Naval Academy and the Air Force Academy in West Point, and it's taken as inspiration by lots of political radicals of various different stripes, left and right, around the world. I meet lots and lots of people who are cryptographers who say that they got into the industry in order to see that vision of technology as a force for human liberation instead of human oppression. And so in some ways, I think that might be my most lasting accomplishment, was to infuse in some small way the dialogue about not what technologists can do, but what technologists should do with this wider ethical conversation. And after 10 years of writing full-time, I found myself getting more and more anxious about the way that the technological battlefield was being tilted more towards control and oppression, and I got involved with Electronic Frontier Foundation again. I found it was increasingly anxious for me to sit on the sidelines and watch that unfold, and I wanted to get back into the fight. And so that's what I've been doing ever since then. I'm mostly working on a campaign that sounds very obscure and technical, but is, I think, very, very important. It's a campaign to overturn a worldwide network of laws that ban reconfiguring your computer if, in so doing, you might weaken a copyright protection system. And these laws have become the go-to means for all kinds of bad things to happen, whether that's GM selling you a car, where in order to put third-party parts in it, you would have to bypass one of these copyright protection schemes, and so you have to use original GM parts, and they can charge whatever they want for it, or Apple using it to put third-party independent service centers out of business, or any of the other ways in which it's been used. John Deere and Johnson & Johnson have made use of these laws to force people with diabetes who buy their artificial pancreas to buy proprietary insulin cartridges that they can charge arbitrary sums for. And with these market abuses is, if anything, an even scarier element, which is that these laws also prohibit the publication of disclosure by independent security researchers if that disclosure might weaken a copyright protection scheme. And so what you end up with is this ever wider constellation of devices that are like, festering incubators for long-lived digital pathogens that can attack us in these novel ways, whether they're in voting machines or cars or HVAC systems, and where we're not allowed to know about them until they become so widely exploited that no one can deny them anymore. And then finally, security researchers start coming forward with them. This is increasingly a problem that we see all around the world. And in the U.S., we have two plaintiffs who are representing in a lawsuit against the U.S. government to overturn these laws. More recently, I've been working on a European campaign because I have a lot of experience with European digital politics. I kind of got tapped at EFF to fill a hole that they had. And this is a campaign over the next copyright directive. The EU is updating its copyright law for the first time in 17 years. And while most of the rules that they're proposing are very sensible and welcome, there is an incredibly damaging and terrifying element of these proposals that says that anyone who allows the public to communicate, any platform where the public can post those, whether that's the server where this podcast will live or the social media network where you find it, anyone who operates one of those platforms will have to have a crowdsourced database that anyone can put anything into and claim it as their copyright. And if anyone else tries to post that thing, it will be censored. And these unaccountable databases will be just a kind of attractive nuisance for every kind of censor and bully and even just sloppy person who doesn't want to bother checking whether all the things that they're uploading to the database are indeed their copyrights or just, whether they've got some tuna in or rather some dolphins in their tuna net as they compile their list of things that they wanted to see blocked on the internet. So that's a kind of good capsule of where I am now. I live in Los Angeles. My wife works at Disney. She's a vice president there, and she runs their experimental media division. And it's true that sometimes puts us at political odds, but that's okay with me and okay with her. I'm also a Disney alumnus. I was a consultant to them. I was the artist in residence at Disney Imagineering for a time and have a long experience of them and a long artistic interest in built environments and in immersive entertainment, which is in part how I ended up working at Disney. And I continue to consult for them. I get emails, I think, every day now from people who saw my name at the end of the Wreck-It Ralph 2 credits because I did a little consulting on that.
Wow. Thank you, Cory. Cory Doctorow, our guest today. Just in laying that out, you could see we've got like several topics that I think we could spend most of the time on. But let's go in right now just a little deeper because you went fairly deep into the European Parliament Copyright Directive. And I just want to dig in just a little deeper.
Sure.
Why did this directive happen? Was it just that time had lapsed since the last time, or was there some problem that led to it? What was the what led to those proceedings?
Sure. Well, for better or for worse, we use copyright as kind of the first line of regulation of the internet. It's kind of a historic accident, really. Every regulation has to have some kind of meta regulation that says, who does this regulation apply to? I often think that it would be wonderful if we had meaningful finance regulation in this country, but I wouldn't want it to kick in every time I gave my daughter her allowance, right? And so we need some kind of litmus test to say, are you in the scope of the regulation or aren't you? And in the case of copyright, it's, are you making or handling copies of creative works? And if you are, copyright assumes that you're part of the entertainment industry. And, as someone who is a fully paid-up member of the entertainment industry who's hoping to put his kid through college through his royalties, I definitely consider myself part of the entertainment industry and want to see the entertainment industry to have good rules. But I think even more important than good rules is scoped rules that correctly decide who is covered by them and who isn't. So one of the weird consequences of saying that if you make or handle a creative work, you are in the entertainment industry, is that everything in the internet involves handling creative works. I mean, we are just by making this voice phone call, which is traveling on the internet, we are making hundreds and even maybe thousands copies, very transient, brief copies in different kinds of buffers and bits of network infrastructure of creative works. And every conversation we have on the internet is now potentially a copyrightable work because it's fixed, and it's once it's fixed, it's eligible for copyright. Copyright starts to adhere in it. And so we've arrived at this weird impasse where we expect there to be a body of law that is, on the one hand, technical and nuanced enough that Universal Studios, just around the corner from me here in Burbank, can license the Harry Potter copyrights from Warner Brothers, which are also around the corner from me here in Burbank, and in so doing arrive at a scheme that is technical and detailed enough that everybody feels that they know what's what and that that there's no ambiguity in there. And we also expect those technical, complicated rules to be fit for purpose when a 12-year-old going to middle school with my daughter here in Burbank, who writes Harry Potter fan fiction and posts them for her friends to see on the internet, also gets those rules right. And, again, as a fully paid-up member of the entertainment industry, I really want there to be fit technical rules for my industry, not simple technical rules for my industry, because those are really at odds with each other. And either we make the rules simple enough for a middle schooler to follow, in which case they'll be of no use to Universal and Warner, or we make them nuanced enough for Universal and Warner, in which case 12-year-olds are going to be de facto criminals. And they are. And that is a huge problem. And as a result of the of copyrights being the first line of defense in Internet regulation, it's also a rule that needs a lot of updating because the Internet changes really quickly. And so we have all kinds of new technical questions to ask about what rules we should have for the Internet because they're what rules we should have for copyright. And so 17 years after the last time the EU had asked itself what should our copyright rules be, the world had moved on. And so they spent several years working through a set of proposals to this monster directive. These European directives, they're huge, sprawling omnibus legislation, right? They incorporate all kinds of different clauses that are not necessarily consistent with one another or form a coherent picture, but rather are kind of grab bag under the wide banner of, say, copyright or privacy or what have you. And so these copyright rules mostly are very sensible because usually by the time the rules get in front of the Parliament, all of this work has happened in the committee. The Parliament, if you can imagine, it's a Parliament that represents 500 million people in 28 countries.
Right.
And so when it meets, it has a lot of business to do. And so it doesn't want to have clause-by-clause debates of every law that gets put in front of it. Instead, it wants to vote up or down on those laws. And it wants all the hard work to be done in the committee. And that's what had happened with the copyright directive. And then because of the way that the European Union, the roles in the European Union rotate around, for example, they appoint a new president every year or so. And the person who was in charge of the drafting of this changed over last spring. And this German member of the European Parliament named Axel Voss became the new rapporteur for this, and that put him in charge of the drafting. And early on in the drafting, there had been these two very extreme proposals backed by very specific and parochial industries that no one else had any appetite for, been so controversial that they'd really been taken off the table, and he revived them. And he revived them with weeks to go before the first critical vote in this. So we have this piece of must-pass legislation, and Voss decided he would take the whole copyright directive hostage by putting in these two controversial proposals. And one was backed by the record industry and by an industry player called Audible Magic, which is a not very large company that does automatic song identification. You know this thing on your phone where it just you play a few bars and it tells you what it is?
Yep.
So Audible Magic thought, if we can make it a legal requirement for every platform to buy software like ours, since we're the industry leader, it will probably be ours, then we'll make a lot more money. And they collaborated with the record industry in this massive lobbying effort to get members of the European Parliament to back the idea that every platform that allowed for any kind of audio to be uploaded should have to implement a filter to find copyrighted works. But the way that got written was it was any platform on which a copyrighted work might appear. So that includes every Twitter update, every Facebook update, every sound, every video, every still photo would have to somehow know whether or not the user was posting something copyrighted, and if they were, block it. And that is extremely broad.
Yes.
And it goes...
And what it leads to, as you said, what it leads to is it leads to enormous surveillance.
Yeah, and also, you know, Audible Magic doesn't make that tool, right? They don't make a tool that can look at your Minecraft skins and figure out whether they're copyrighted. They can't ingest 400 hours of YouTube video per minute and figure out whether the moving images in it or still images in it are copyrighted. And most importantly, no Audible Magic product nor any other product can make a judgment about whether a use is fair dealing, which is the European equivalent to fair use, or not. And so this has lots of problems. Like if you're a news photographer and you go out and you shoot an important newsworthy photo and on the street, say a big demonstration, and there's a bus that goes by in the background with a big ad on the side of it that has some stock art that has been registered as copyrighted by Corbis, then the platforms aren't going to let you post your news photo because they're going to identify you as someone who is infringing on Corbis's copyright. And so this badly thought-through bit of rent-seeking became a flashpoint that is still, as I speak to you today, up in the air. We're not really sure what's going to happen. Yesterday, there was meant to be what was probably going to be the second-to-last meeting on it. The last one would have been the parliamentary vote that would have made it law. And that meeting was canceled. But I'm told that that meeting might be back on again as soon as tomorrow. And it really depends on whether the German negotiators flip. They came out against this, but they might come out for it. So that was one of the two proposals that was reinserted by Voss. The other one was a proposal to allow news sites to bar people from linking to them if the link included more than one word from the headline or the news story. So just the web address usually has more than one word in it.
Exactly.
And the idea here was to revive a failed experiment that had taken place in Spain and Germany, where these very concentrated newspaper industries decided that they wanted to get paid by Google for Google News, which is the service that aggregates news headlines and short snippets, one sentence. And so they got national laws passed that said that you couldn't link to them with and include the headline or even a brief excerpt without paying for them. And that they, moreover, what's implied by this is they also get to decide who can link to them. Because if there's a paid license, then that license can be denied. They can also decide who has to pay for the license and who doesn't. So they could say, well, if you're a big platform we depend on for traffic like Google, we're going to give you a preferential rate because Google's got more negotiating leverage when they sit down across the table from them. But if you're a small independent European company, then they're going to soak you for every euro they can get out of you. And indeed, that's what's happened. And what happened with those laws is that Google just shut down Google News in Germany and Spain. And the traffic to those newspapers' websites fell off a cliff. And they scrambled to give Google free licenses in the hopes of getting it reinstated in the laws. And so the version that was introduced on the European-wide level would try to solve this negotiating imbalance by making it mandatory for all websites to require licenses, all news websites to require licenses. So open access websites like ProPublica that make their work available on a Creative Commons license would be banned from doing so. They would have to get a license. Even if it was a free license, it would have to be papered over. They would have to have a contract lawyer sit down with every website that wanted to link to them and negotiate those terms. And again, that serves the interests of a few aristocratic German newspaper families that have been in the business for centuries, but it doesn't really serve the interests of the news industry. And, you know, the League of Investigative Journalists, the people who had covered the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers came out against this. And so both of these very controversial proposals threaten to scuttle the whole directive. And at the last moment, as I said, this last meeting was canceled, and it put the directive on life support. And what I'm told is that the French, who were in favor of it, and the Germans, who were opposed to it, have been furiously negotiating and hoping to find an exemption for smaller businesses that might placate the German tech industry, which is quite influential, but which doesn't have anything like the scale of Google, and which understands that, putting in place measures that Google can afford and that German companies can't just means that Google never has to compete with them. So here we are, arrived on a great battlefield, as Lincoln once said, and it is unclear what's going to happen next. If this exemption for smaller companies is carved out, it may give the appearance of reasonableness to this otherwise unreasonable rule, but the burdens are so onerous for companies scale that the directive contemplates for companies that reach the scale where the directive starts to apply to them, that it would essentially doom all small European companies to staying very small indeed. Building the kinds of filters that the directive contemplates would cost hundreds of millions of euros. The very small and modest filter that Google has just to look at its video files cost about $100 million to build, and it does a tiny fraction of what this rule would require. And so what this would mean is that if you were a European company whose revenues were below 10 million euros, you could trundle along until the day you made your 10th million euro in revenue, and then you would have to find several hundred million euros to start complying with the rules, and that would be the end of things for you. You would be driven out of business the day you made your 10 million and first euro. And so that compromise would be no compromise at all, but it might look like a compromise enough that the rule would pass, in which case the next phase would be trying to fight it in the parliament and then fight it in the courts. And that is a longer and messier battle. It would be much easier if this would die now.
Okay. Let me make a couple of comments and then a couple of questions that relate to that.
Sure.
Some of what you're talking about in terms of tech regulation reminds me of what's been going on in other fields forever, right? Simple example, I can remember looking at environmental issues. Big waste companies fight new rules for disposals in landfills till they're inevitable. Then they, through their lobbyists, write the new rules so that only the biggest players can afford to comply with them, right? As you say, a monopolist, this is a quote, a monopolist's first preference is for no regulation. Its close second is for lots of regulation, especially the kind of regulation that no competitor could possibly comply with. So that's what's going on here, right? And it's a common play. The other thing I want to ask was, okay, we've dealt a lot with what sounds potentially terrible, but is the European Union. How much should Americans, who many of whom are probably hearing about this for the first time, care about this?
It remains to be seen what the big platforms are going to do if they come under this burden. It seems unlikely that they're going to abandon the European Union. It is the largest market in the world of middle-class consumers. I think China may be catching up on it, but 500 million Europeans. And it's although you could imagine how, say, like YouTube might work with these filters in place, it already kind of works that way. You may have seen a link to a video and followed it and seen this video is not available in your country. Right. But how would it work on a social platform like Twitter or Facebook? Imagine that someone in America posts an opinion, and someone replies with their opinion from Europe that contains a phrase that has been copyrighted. They quote a news article or a poem or just something that someone has laid claim to that they shouldn't have. Maybe someone has uploaded the complete works of Shakespeare to Facebook and laid claim to it. And in the time between them making that claim and someone at Facebook going through and pulling all of those claims out, all Europeans are banned from quoting Shakespeare on Facebook. So someone quotes Shakespeare in their reply. Now, that reply, even though it was made by a European, is blocked in Europe. So an American can see it, but a European can't. So the American replies, and the other Europeans in the discussion can't figure out what they're talking about because there's a blacked-out reply in the middle. And continue this down the way, and you end up with a conversation that's so fragmented that it can't possibly take place. So if you're Facebook or Twitter or even WordPress, and you're trying to figure out how do you allow people to talk to each other when you have to black out the words or pictures or other contributions of some parties? I think the answer is the race to the bottom.
Yeah.
I think the answer is that everybody gets blocked like they're a European.
Yeah.
In the same way that right now there's a lot of websites that are complying with the European General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR.
Yeah.
And that's redounding to our good. I think Europe has become like a net exporter of good privacy rules, the same way California is a net exporter of good emissions.
Auto emissions rules, yep.
Yeah. And they could become Germany could become the world's leading exporter of bad copyright laws, too, that result in mass censorship of the Internet, where we all end up living under German copyright rules because of the way the leverage works.
Yeah, if a player is big enough, people would rather conform to that player than make 2, 3, 10, many versions of the same thing. That's
and I'm an instrumentalist on this. Like, I think that we need to get tech policy right, because the Internet is not, a pornography distribution system or a jihadi recruiting tool or a video on demand system. It's like our species-wide planet scale digital nervous system, and everything we do involves it. And so I want to get that policy right. And if the way to get that right is to convince the European Union to make good policies that the rest of the world ends up getting in line behind, then I'm fine with that. But I don't have a particular preference or dispreference for the European Union making Internet rules. I just don't want them to make bad Internet rules.
For sure. Anything listeners can do, or is it just now watch with bated breath?
It really remains to be seen. Everything is shifting around. Like literally within the next hour or two, we'll probably know whether the Germans and the French compromised. And if they have, we're going to have to get the national negotiators who are going into this next phase, because this next phase, it's called the trilogue, which is this crazy European coinage for a dialogue between three parties. It's the European presidency, the nations of Europe, and the European Parliament all get together and negotiate. And with these national governments in the room, they have the power to form what's called a blocking minority, and that's if a majority of the countries or countries representing 36% of the population of Europe object to something, then it dies. And on paper, we have more than enough countries who oppose this, but they have different reasons for opposing it.
Yeah.
And they also don't necessarily like each other very much. So the Italian government, for example, is this fusion of two extremely different kinds of political parties. One is this insurgent, somewhat progressive movement called the Five Star Movement, and the other one is a neo-fascist movement called Liga. And they've come together, weirdly enough, to make a coalition government.
Yeah.
And Five Star really understands how important a free and open Internet is, because its founder, who is a former clown, I'm not making this up, named Beppe Grillo, he came to prominence when Berlusconi was running Italy, and Berlusconi owned a giant media empire. It was like if Rupert Murdoch had been president of the United States. And so he had this bully pulpit. If you think that Fox and Trump have a close relationship, imagine if Fox was owned by Trump.
Yep.
And started using YouTube to circumvent Berlusconi's stranglehold on Italian politics, and completely remade the face of Italian politics as a result. A lot of the disgrace that Berlusconi found himself in was the result of his inability to rein in YouTube. So in its DNA, Five Star really thinks that the Internet is important and a free and open Internet is important. Liga, on the other hand, are part of these far-right xenophobic parties, and the far right has found itself increasingly subject to what's sometimes called no platforming, which is when the big tech platforms decide that they violated their terms of service and kick them off, which again, I have no great love for xenophobic anti-migrant parties as an immigrant who is the son of a refugee. But at the same time, I think that if you think that power will only be used against your political enemies, you're being very short-sighted. And I think that as these guys look at Google and the other big platforms kicking off Nazis, and then they see rules that say to start a new Nazi version of Twitter, you need 500 million euros to run a filter, they're like, oh, wait a second, we don't like that rule either. So you have this Eurosceptic government from Italy that doesn't want the filter, but then you have governments that are quite fond of Europe, like the German government, who also don't want to filter, but they don't like Italy.
Right.
And so getting them to all agree on an approach has proven to be hard, and as a result, this rule has gotten a lot farther than it should have because it's got this divided opposition.
Yeah, no, as you point out, that happens at times, and you, I think you even use it in some of that tension or that problem, if you will, of you can all be opposed to something, but if you're opposed to it for different reasons and have different countermeasures, or you're just opposed to each other, then you can lose. And the good guys can lose because they can't agree. Let me tell people, this is Free Forum, a world that just might work. I'm Terrence McNally. I'm speaking with CORY DOCTOROW, science fiction writer, activist, journalist, author most recently of the novel Walkaways, the graphic novel In Real Life, the nonfiction book Information Doesn't Want to Be Free, and his next work of fiction coming out soon is called Radicalized, and you can learn more at Craphound, CRAPHOUND.com. I always look at it, and when I first look at it, I want to say Craphound because of the PH, but I'm probably not the first one to see that.
That's funny.
I want to shift completely,
Sure.
Having drilled down, deeply into that. Let's shift to Walkaway. Walkaway is your latest novel. It's an adult novel, and I've heard you describe it as, I think, either an optimistic or a positive disaster novel. What do you mean by that, and why?
Yeah, I really take my cues here from one of my favorite nonfiction writers, the author and historian Rebecca Solnit, who people know best, I think, for what amounts to a very minor accomplishment in a very storied career, but she coined the term mansplaining, which for the women in your audience, mansplaining is when a man explains something to you that you already understand. Thank you.
That's right. That's demonstration by example, right? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. And Solnit, she wrote this astoundingly good book called A Paradise Built in Hell. That's a history of disasters and their aftermath.
So the point of Paradise Built in Hell is?
It's that we tell ourselves a story that when disaster strikes, people turn on each other. That when neighbors are coming over to eat you, and this is a kind of easy dramatic device to use when you're writing the kind of pulp fiction that I write. You can you can avoid the hard choice between man against man and man against nature, and just have man against nature against man. So the tsunami knocks your house down, and then your neighbors come over to make you their sex slave or whatever. But the actual lived reality of people who've been in disasters is quite the opposite. That a disaster is the moment when the background refrigerator hum of all your petty grievances comes to an end and leaves behind a kind of ringing silence. And in that silence, you realize that you have more in common with your neighbor than you have in difference, and that you have a duty to them and they have a duty to you. And that's when people run to each other and start digging through the rubble. And so that kind of optimistic disaster story is, I think, ultimately the best kind of optimism to have. There's a sick optimism, which is the idea that things just won't ever go wrong. And you can see the problems with this if you imagine it as an engineering practice, right? If you design a system on the assumption that nothing will ever go wrong, then you build the Titanic and don't bother putting any lifeboats on it.
Right.
That good engineers are not engineers who decide nothing will go wrong. They're people who design for graceful failure and who design systems that when they stop working, you can get them started again. And for me, the most optimistic thing to believe is not that our society will never face problems that cause, catastrophic collapses, but rather that when those catastrophic collapses arrive, that we have the will and the wit and the kindness to come together to get the machine running again. And so Walkaway is a novel about people who are living through a crisis that I think would be very recognizable to people who follow the debate about climate and the economy. The climate has completely fallen apart, and it's set great waves of refugees in motion and destroyed a lot of wealth and really undermined the general prosperity. And at the same time, the economy has become even more polarized than it is today, with the super rich growing so very rich that most of us cease to have any economic rationale for existing. I'm to be around to depress the wages of the few of us who are doing the work that needs doing that hasn't been fully automated. But the rest of us are just surplus to requirements, extra mouths to feed, pennies to be skimmed by these great, voracious businesses that for whom we barely even make a meal. And so against that backdrop, this movement called Walkaways forms. And what they do is walk out of the world and into these very common and easy to find brownfield sites that have been left behind by climate change and abandoned as uninhabitable. And they use software stolen from the UN High Commission on Refugees to survey the land around them using drones, figure out what material is there in the ruins and in the trash heaps, and then automatically design fully automated luxury communist resorts that can be built using whatever is lying around, build the things, and then just allow anyone to live in them and spend all of their time just trying to figure out how to live their best lives without having to worry about the traditional trappings of economics. And that's going very, every now and again, some weirdo decides that they want the garbage and blighted land that the Walkaways are living on, and that they have some weird property claim to it, and the Walkaways say, well, if that's the way you feel, we'll just go find some more garbage and build another fully automated luxury communist resort out of it. And that's going very well until the scientists who work for the super rich on a project to achieve a kind of technological immortality where you can upload your brain into a computer and never have to die, realize that they are in fact engaged in bifurcating the species into immortal super rich titans, and the rest of us will become kind of mayflies disappearing in the rear view mirrors as they become infinitely prolonged. And rather than continuing that project on behalf of the super rich, they steal all their own research and take off and walk back out into the Badlands, become Walkaways, and open source all of that immortality stuff. And at that point, the super rich realize that they're going to have to spend eternity with us. And that's so intolerable that that's the moment at which the Hellfire missiles come out, and that's when the novel really gets going.
Okay. Now, anyone who gathered that sees that there's a lot going on here. And when you write a book like this, Cory, you are writing a plot, you are writing a story, but you are very much also writing ideas. How do you approach those two? And by the way, I would say, in my experience, sci-fi, speculative fiction seems to take this on more than other kinds of fiction. It seems to be a pretty normal thing that ideas end up being a character. How do you approach that?
It's not an explicit thing. There isn't a kind of formula for me of, 1/3 exposition, 2/3 characterization or something.
Yeah.
It's in some ways, I think, like all artistic practice, it is irreducible. The way you write is by practicing your writing until you get an intuitive sense of what good writing is, and then you write as well as you can. And I know that's not hugely satisfying, but honest answer I have, the part of writing that is very analytic is rewriting and critiquing other people's work. And what I think is that in this highly technical time that we live in, where much of what we do is governed by these invisible, hard-to-understand processes, that it's easy to become afraid and confused. And that the upside of that from the perspective of a writer is that if you explain to people how those processes work, and if you make them visible and tangible and comprehensible, then there is an intrinsic interestingness to them. And so some of what helps science fiction get along when it's this kind of science fiction that I can afford to devote the verbiage to explaining how the underlying technology works and how the people relate to it in a very discursive way that is nevertheless, essential to the plot. And when I do that, it's not, I hope, boring, but rather very engaging, because at the same time as you are getting this technical detail that matters to the characters, you're also having realizations about how the world that you live in, the milieu in which you are reading that book, works.
Okay, now it seems to me, by the way, when I say a novel of ideas, I'm not even referring necessarily to the technical, but to the human software, the human ways that we function. And let me tell you, the first exchange where I went, okay, we're dealing with something a little richer than I might have known, and I'm going to actually read from your book, and then you can respond to it. So
Sure.
Your character, Hubert, etc., we're probably about 20 pages in or something, and he's met. He's not a walkaway. The characters at this point are not walkaways. He's a normal guy, and he meets a daughter of a very rich family, as you've described, the very rich there, at a party, and they end up having a conversation. He ends up meeting her father, the very rich guy, and so on. And this is what he says about her father and his type. The tragedy of human existence is that the world is run by people who are really good at kidding themselves, like your father. Your dad manages to kid himself that he's rich and powerful because he's the cream and has risen to the top. But he's not stupid. He knows he's kidding himself. So underneath the top layer of bullshit is another, more aware belief system, the belief that everyone else would kid themselves the same way he does if they had the chance. His beliefs don't start with the idea that it's okay to kid yourself, you're a special snowflake who deserves more cookies than all the other kids. It starts with the idea that it's human nature to kid yourself and take the last cookie. So if he doesn't, someone else will. So he'd better be the most lavishly self-deluded of all, the most prolific taker of cookies, lest someone more horrible, immoral, and greedy than he gets there first, eats all the cookies, takes the plate, and charges rent to drink the milk. Now that tells me we're dealing with, I love that there's actually 3 levels sort of delusion there. And that's his human nature, if you will, explanation of how the rich get along with themselves. Talk to us a little bit about that and what else, why this stuff pops up in your novel.
So, there's this darling of the American super rich and the economists who support them, a guy named Buchanan, who won a Nobel Prize for something called public choice theory. And it's a very complicated theory, and I think that there's lots of it that's just self-serving rubbish. But
let me cut in 1 second, Corey, and tell you I interviewed Nancy MacLean, who wrote her book Democracy in Chains recently, and people can find that podcast, which will go into depth into what he's talking about right here. Go ahead.
Sure. But there is one way of thinking about public choice theory that I think is actually much more generous than MacLean is in her account of it, which is that no one is the villain in their own story. Everybody thinks that they are doing good and is somehow arriving at a place where actions that seem unsupportable are somehow justifiable in their minds. And a lot of the time, figuring out how someone who is someone who's doing something that's obviously terrible is managing to tell themselves that they're not, is a very useful thought exercise, both in intervening in ways that stem their worst conduct, but also just in understanding how you can rally people around yourself and just understanding humanity better and understanding how your own choices are getting you in trouble, how you're kidding yourself, how you are the villain in someone else's story. And the part of the book that you just read, it's really the part where this guy is saying, how can I empathize without sympathizing with someone who is definitely the villain in this story? How can I understand where they're coming from without letting them off the hook. There's a writer I really like very well. Her name is Laurie Penny, and she's a feminist science fiction writer and journalist from the United Kingdom. She's a former student of mine. And her last book was an essay collection called The Bitch Doctrine about feminism in the 21st century. And among other things, she was on the tour bus with Milo Yiannopoulos and his, flock of lost boys. And she writes beautifully about exactly how they've kidded themselves into thinking that they're not the villains. Mm-hmm. And there's an enormous amount of empathy for where they're coming from, but not 1 gram of sympathy. She never lets them off the hook for being the monsters that they are. She just explains how they got there and how they look themselves in the mirror. And it's such a useful perspective to have, and one that I try to get at in all of my books. And, that's what that chapter is about, or that passage is about. It's on the one hand, it is that explanation, how does this villain look himself in the mirror? And on the other hand, it's an explanation how you arrive at that kind of explanation, what you do to get there.
Yeah, and I would say, by the way, that that same exercise of what does this look like, feel like to them, what are they telling themselves, obviously it's not just about how people start corporations or political parties, but how what they're doing in their relationship with you this afternoon or this evening, in personal terms. We've got to bring this to a close, Cory. I really have enjoyed it, and we've just touched what the pages of preparation that have gone by the wayside. Is just that there's so much, and your approach is to things is so informative. I really recommend to people. The website is craphound.com, CRAPHOUND.com. Some of the books are the novel Walkaway, the graphic novel In Real Life. Information Doesn't Want to Be Free. Boingboing.net is the blog that you edit, correct?
Yeah, we turned 19 years old yesterday.
Wow,
one of the oldest.
I was going to say, absolutely
exists.
Okay, for this conversation and many other interviews, articles, transcripts, and so on, to join me in pursuit of a world that just might work, go to TerenceMcNally.net or worldthatjustmightwork.com. They're the same website. If you want to receive my weekly email announcements of guests and issues, plus 8 or so articles that I think are relevant to flesh out the conversation, sign up at my site or email me at temcnally@mac.com. You can also subscribe and listen to the Freeform podcast on Apple Podcasts. You can find years of podcasts at my site, TerenceMcNally.net, or at, as I said, Apple Podcasts and so on. They include Michael Lewis, Jeremy Scahill, Naomi Klein, Robert Reich, Van Jones, Connie Rice, Greg Boyle, etc. You can follow me on Twitter at McNally-Terrence. Thanks to Matt Perez in production, Mark Maxwell in production, George Vasilopoulos at Progressive Voices, and most of all, you, my listeners, please share this podcast widely. Thank you, Cory Doctorow. Keep up the good work.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure.